She was invisible. Just a quiet woman in row 8, nobody looking at her twice. Then the captain screamed, "We have a problem." And both pilots collapsed. She walked to that cockpit and took over completely. And when military Black Hawks heard her voice on the radio, they called her commander. Before you watch full story, comment below from which country are you watching. Don't forget to subscribe for more amazing stories. The sky over Miami was dying. That was the only way to describe it. At 6:47 in the evening on Friday, July 26, 2024, the sky above Miami International Airport had turned a color that no weather app could properly explain, a dark, dirty gray-green, like the belly of something ancient and angry, pressing down on the city with the slow, terrible patience of a storm that knew it had already won. The clouds were not moving the way normal clouds moved. They were churning. Rotating in slow, heavy circles, pulling the last light of day into themselves and swallowing it whole. Inside the terminal, the panic was quiet but total. Thousands of travelers stood in front of departure boards, watching the red letters multiply like a disease. Delayed. Cancelled. Delayed. Cancelled. The sound of rolling suitcases had replaced the sound of conversation. People were on their phones, checking weather apps with fingers that moved too fast, calling hotels, calling family members, calling anyone who might tell them what to do. Children sat on top of carry-on bags and ate airport pretzels, blissfully unaware that the adults around them were calculating the odds of getting home before the storm turned everything into chaos. Gate D38 was a different kind of madness. American Airlines Flight 2891, bound for Boston, had been announced as one of the last flights that the tower was clearing for departure before Miami International shut down completely. A Boeing 737-800, configured to carry 160 passengers, already 40 minutes behind schedule, sitting at gate D38 like a soldier who had been given one last chance to complete a mission before the enemy arrived. The gate agents were not calm. The boarding announcement had gone from polite to urgent to something very close to desperate. Final boarding, Flight 2891, final boarding, all passengers must be on board immediately, this is the final call. People were running. Not the full sprint of someone chasing a bus, but the tight, controlled, embarrassed run of adults who have decided that dignity is less important than getting on a plane. Business travelers in loosened ties, rolling their laptop bags behind them with one hand and holding their boarding passes with the other. Families moving in formation, the parents in front cutting through the crowd, children holding onto backpack straps, grandparents moving as fast as they could with the apologetic shuffle of people who wished they could move faster. College students with oversized backpacks and earbuds around their necks, moving with the casual speed of people who had definitely cut it too close but were not going to admit that. Among all of these people, in the middle of all this noise and rushing and barely controlled anxiety, there was a woman who was not rushing. She walked at a steady, even pace. Not slow, not fast. The exact speed of someone who had calculated exactly how much time they had and was using exactly the right amount of it. She was carrying a small leather messenger bag on one shoulder and a compact backpack on her back, and she moved through the crowd the way water moves through rocks, not fighting anything, not pushing anyone, simply finding the path that was already there and taking it. People stepped aside for her without knowing why they had stepped aside. There was something in the way she moved that made space happen around her, the way a ship's bow makes water part without the water understanding it is parting. She was in her early 40s, maybe 5 feet and 6 inches tall, with a compact athletic build that suggested not a gym membership but a life that had required her body to be capable of things most people would never ask of it. Her skin was dark, a deep brown with warm undertones, her face carrying the kind of quiet strength that comes not from looking strong but from having been strong for so long that it had become the default expression. Her hair was natural, cut short in a neat fade that was practical and clean and said absolutely nothing about trying to impress anyone. She was wearing black pants that fit well but not expensively, and a charcoal gray long-sleeve shirt that could have been business casual or just comfortable travel clothes. There was no jewelry except a simple black watch on her left wrist. She was carrying a worn paperback book. Tom Clancy. Red storm rising. She found her seat, 8A, window seat, left side, economy class, and she settled into it with the practiced efficiency of someone who has sat in aircraft seats thousands of times. The messenger bag went under the seat in front of her, positioned with a precision that left exactly the right amount of foot space. The backpack went into the overhead bin, placed flat against the back, making room for someone else's bag without being asked to do so. She buckled her seatbelt, adjusted it once, and opened her book. In seat 8B, the middle seat, the seat that nobody wants, the seat that gets assigned to you when you book late or when the airline's algorithm decides you deserve a reminder that you are not special, there was a man who had been staring at the approaching storm through the terminal windows for the last 20 minutes and was deeply unhappy about several things simultaneously. He was unhappy about the weather. He was unhappy about being in a middle seat. He was unhappy about the 40-minute delay. He was unhappy about the pretzels he had eaten from a vending machine that had cost $4 and tasted like cardboard shaped to look like pretzels. When he sat down, the woman in 8A shifted slightly and efficiently to give him room to settle, the way experienced travelers do when they understand that everyone in economy class is in this together whether they like it or not. He registered her in the way that people register their seatmates on flights, a quick, unconscious assessment designed to answer the single question of whether this person is going to make the next few hours more difficult. His assessment was, black woman, 40s, looks fit, reading a book, probably wants peace and quiet. He plugged in his earbuds and forgot she existed. He had absolutely no idea. No idea that the quiet woman reading Tom Clancy in seat 8A was Lieutenant Colonel Diana Washington. No idea that the United States Army had given her the call sign, Storm, not because of the weather, but because she was the pilot that commanders called when the situation was already catastrophic. When the helicopter was going down in fire. When the soldiers were surrounded and there was no safe landing zone. When every other pilot had looked at the mission briefing and calculated the odds of survival and quietly shaken their head. When all of that was true, they called Storm, because Storm flew into disasters the way other pilots flew away from them, and she brought people home. Her full record was the kind of thing that got talked about in military aviation circles in hushed, almost disbelieving voices. 18 years of service. 4,800 total flight hours. 3,200 of those hours in UH-60 Black Hawk helicopters, the Army's primary utility and assault helicopter, a machine that demanded total respect and absolute skill from every pilot who sat in its cockpit. 3 combat deployments, 2 to Iraq, 1 to Afghanistan, and several classified operations that she was not permitted to discuss and would not discuss even if permitted. 327 total combat missions. 23 successful combat rescue missions, the kind where she flew into active firefights to pull out wounded soldiers, where she landed in places that were not landing zones because there were no landing zones, where she flew through things that would have made lesser pilots turn back. 47 lives saved under direct enemy fire. She had been shot at more than 100 times. 2 of her helicopters had been so severely damaged that she had been forced to execute emergency landings, once in a mountain valley in Afghanistan at night with no working instruments and a rotor system that was held together by something closer to hope than engineering. She held the Army record for most successful combat rescue missions by a single pilot. She had received the Distinguished Flying Cross, the Bronze Star with Valor Device, the Air Medal with 15 oak leaf clusters, and a classified commendation from a mission so sensitive that the Army did not officially acknowledge it had happened, which meant Diana Washington could not acknowledge it either, which she found mildly amusing. She currently commanded the most elite Black Hawk unit in the 160th Special Operations Aviation Regiment, the Night Stalkers, the Army's Special Operations Aviation Force, the pilots who flew the missions that nobody else could fly. She commanded 40-plus pilots. She had trained hundreds of Army aviators over her career. Her reputation, among the people who knew, was simple and absolute: she never panicked. She never failed. She never left anyone behind. Today, she was on approved leave. She was going to Boston to surprise her mother for her 70th birthday. She had booked the seat herself, in economy, because she did not think of herself as someone who required special treatment. She had packed light because she always packed light. She had brought the Tom Clancy novel because she had been meaning to reread it for 3 years and had never found the time. She was going to spend 2 weeks being Diana instead of Commander Storm. She was going to eat her mother's cooking and sleep past 5 in the morning and not think about flight rosters and mission briefings and the weight that came with being responsible for every pilot under her command. That plan was about to fail in the most spectacular way possible. At 7:10 in the evening, with the storm pressing against Miami like a fist against a door, American Airlines Flight 2891 received its takeoff clearance from Miami Tower and began its roll down runway 30. The 737 lifted into the gray-green sky with the solid, powerful confidence of a well-maintained aircraft pushed by 2 capable CFM56 engines. It climbed through the bottom layer of clouds and came out into the darkening sky above, where the storm was a wall to the west but still navigable to the north and east. Captain Marcus Reed, 52 years old, 19,000 hours of flight time, 28 years flying commercial aircraft, began his climb to cruising altitude with the easy competence of a man who had done this 10,000 times. His first officer, Sarah Mitchell, 37 years old, 8,900 hours, 13 years flying, worked through her post-takeoff checklist with the same steady professionalism. In Seat 8A, Diana Washington turned a page of her book. She was not reading it, not really. She was doing what pilots do when they are in aircraft, which is a kind of unconscious monitoring that never fully turns off regardless of what else they are doing. It is not attention, exactly. It is more like background awareness, a part of the brain that keeps listening even when the rest of the brain is occupied elsewhere, a system that has been trained over thousands of hours to notice when something sounds wrong or feels wrong or is wrong in ways that cannot be precisely articulated but are absolutely certain. The first 31 minutes of the flight were normal. There was turbulence as they climbed through the storm layer. Standard. The aircraft bucked and shuddered in the way that 737s buck and shudder, which is solidly and without drama, and then leveled off as they cleared the weather below. The seatbelt sign stayed on. A flight attendant came through offering drinks, and Diana ordered water, and the man in 8B ordered a ginger ale with the slightly embarrassed expression of a person who had realized that the turbulence had made him more nervous than he expected. Then, at 7:18 p.m., 31 minutes after takeoff, while Flight 2891 was climbing through 18,000 feet, something began to go wrong. It was not dramatic. That was the thing about this particular emergency, it was almost perfectly designed to be invisible. Somewhere in the pressure hull of the aircraft, in a seam or a rivet point that had been developing a microscopic fracture over months of pressurization cycles, the crack finally became large enough to matter. Not large enough to cause explosive decompression, not large enough to trigger the pressurization warning system, not large enough to do anything dramatic at all. Just large enough to allow a slow, steady leak of pressurized cabin air into the void between the hull layers, reducing the effective cabin pressure so gradually that the aircraft's automated systems were unable to compensate fast enough. The cabin altitude, the altitude equivalent that passengers experience inside the aircraft, which is normally maintained at the equivalent of about 8,000 feet even when the aircraft is at 35,000 feet, began to rise. 8,000 feet. 10,000. 12,000. The threshold at which the human brain begins to suffer measurable cognitive impairment from oxygen deprivation is around 10,000 feet of equivalent altitude. The threshold at which the oxygen masks drop automatically from the ceiling is around 14,000 feet. The cabin altitude was climbing past 12,000 feet, and the masks had not yet dropped. Most of the passengers felt nothing specific. Some felt mildly euphoric in a way they might have attributed to the fact that they had made their flight. Some felt slightly lightheaded in a way they might have attributed to not having eaten enough at the airport. Some felt a growing, undefined sense of unease that they could not explain. Hypoxia is called the silent killer in aviation precisely because of this. It does not hurt, it does not announce itself, it creeps up with a warmth that feels almost pleasant until you are too impaired to recognize that anything is wrong. But Diana Washington was not like most passengers. She had been trained, extensively and repeatedly, to recognize hypoxia. Army helicopter pilots cannot pressurize their aircraft the way commercial jets are pressurized. When a Black Hawk climbs above 10,000 feet, which they do regularly in mountain operations, in high-altitude insertions, in operations in Afghanistan where valley floors are at 8,000 feet and mission objectives are at 12,000, the pilots inside are breathing the outside air, which at those altitudes contains less oxygen per breath. This means that Army helicopter pilots train constantly on hypoxia recognition. They practice identifying the symptoms in themselves and in their crew. They practice the immediate actions. They practice through simulation and through actual high-altitude flight until the recognition of oxygen deprivation is as automatic and instinctive as recognizing thirst. Diana felt at the moment it became real. Her breathing felt slightly labored. Not painful, not alarming to anyone watching, just a small, subtle change in the effort required to draw a full breath, like the air had become slightly thinner, slightly less satisfying than it should be. The airflow from the overhead ventilation felt different. Not wrong in any way she could have described to someone without training, but wrong in the way that a pilot's body knows things before the pilot's conscious mind has processed them. She lowered her book. She sat still for exactly 4 seconds, listening. Not to sounds exactly, but to the quality of the aircraft around her. The pressurization system, the pumps and valves that maintain cabin pressure, made a sound that was part of the background noise of any commercial flight, a low, constant mechanical murmur that nobody noticed because nobody had reason to notice it. Diana noticed it. She had been noticing it unconsciously since they had reached cruise altitude. Now she noticed that it had changed. Not by much. Not in a way that would have registered to anyone who had not spent thousands of hours in pressurized aircraft. But it had changed. It was working too hard. It was compensating for a loss. In the cockpit, Captain Marcus Reed was having a different experience. At first it had felt like turbulence, a sudden, disorienting sense of movement that he could not immediately attribute to the aircraft's attitude. Then it became something else. A heaviness in his head. A narrowing of his peripheral vision that he might have attributed to fatigue if he had not been sitting in the left seat of a commercial aircraft at 18,000 feet. He reached for his checklist with a hand that did not move quite the way he told it to move. "Something's wrong," he said. "Sarah, I feel strange." First Officer Sarah Mitchell looked at him, and in the half-second before she answered him she registered that his face looked gray, that his eyes were unfocused in a way that frightened her, and then she felt it herself, the lightheadedness, the thickness in her thinking, the sensation of the world becoming slightly distant and unreal. "I feel it too," she said. I'm dizzy." Reed understood, in the way that pilots understand things even when they are impaired, what was happening. He knew about decompression. He had trained for it. He knew the emergency procedures. But the hypoxia was already too far advanced, and knowing the procedures and being able to execute them are different things when your brain has been running on insufficient oxygen for several minutes. He reached for the intercom with hands that felt like they belonged to someone else. "We have a problem." His voice came through the intercom and into the cabin like a gunshot. "Losing cabin pressure. Crew to emergency stations." In the cabin, people looked up. The announcement was alarming in content and terrifying in delivery, the voice of a man who was clearly not calm, slurring at the edges in a way that did not sound like a captain making a routine safety announcement. But Reed could not maintain it. He was already sliding back into the gray warmth of hypoxic impairment. He reached for the emergency oxygen system and could not execute the procedure. He tried to key the radio to call air traffic control and fumbled the frequency. Mitchell was trying to help and could not help. Her hands were not working. 90 seconds after Reed's announcement, both pilots were semi-conscious. The aircraft was climbing through 22,000 feet on autopilot. With every 1,000 feet of altitude gained, the outside air contained less oxygen, and the already insufficient pressurization system fell further behind, and the cabin altitude climbed, and the oxygen available to the brain of every person on the aircraft diminished by another fraction. There were, according to Diana's immediate calculation, approximately 4 to 6 minutes before mass unconsciousness. She was already out of her seat. The forward galley of a Boeing 737 is a small space. A food cart on one side, beverage supplies on the other, a small counter, the cockpit door at the far end. Senior Flight Attendant Marcus Thompson, 46 years old, 22 years with American Airlines, was standing in this space trying to understand what the captain's intercom announcement had meant. He had heard problem and pressure and something about crew stations, and he had started toward the passenger cabin to begin whatever emergency procedures applied, but he was not certain which emergency procedures applied because the announcement had been garbled and he was trying to think through a situation he had trained for but never experienced. Diana moved through the cabin quickly. Not running causes panic, but walking with a purpose and a speed that cleared the path in front of her. She reached the galley in 7 seconds. Thompson turned when he heard her. She looked at him the way commanders look at people when there is no time for anything except the essential. "We have rapid decompression," she said. Her voice was completely steady. Not loud, not soft, exactly the volume required for the person in front of her to hear and understand without creating alarm in the cabin behind her. "Everyone in this cabin is becoming hypoxic, including the pilots. In 4 minutes everyone loses consciousness. I need access to that cockpit right now. I'm Lieutenant Colonel Diana Washington, U.S. Army, Black Hawk Commander, 18 years. Flying, 327 combat missions. I know what's happening and I know how to fix it. Open that door or everyone dies. Now." Marcus Thompson had been a flight attendant for 22 years. He had received training in emergency situations, in decompression events, in cockpit intrusion protocols. He knew, with absolute certainty, that no Post-9/11 protocol permitted him to open the cockpit door for a passenger under any circumstances. He had been trained to maintain this position under pressure, under argument, under the most sympathetic-seeming requests imaginable. He looked at Diana Washington's eyes. He had been trained to recognize panic. He had been trained to recognize confusion and desperation masquerading as authority. What he saw in Diana's eyes was none of those things. He saw the absolute, crystalline certainty of a person who had been in rooms where the decision she was making right now was the only thing standing between people being alive and people being dead, and who had made that decision correctly enough times that it had become something beyond confidence. It had become simply the truth. He unlocked the cockpit door. Diana stepped through. What she saw confirmed everything she had diagnosed from seat 8A. Captain Reed was slumped against the left side of his seat, his eyes half open, his right hand resting on the yoke with the disconnected looseness of someone who was touching it rather than flying it. First Officer Mitchell's head had fallen slightly to the right, her chest rising and falling with the slow, shallow breathing of someone whose body was still running on the oxygen reserves in their blood. The aircraft was on autopilot, still climbing, passing through 23,000 feet. Every additional foot of altitude made the situation worse. Diana did 3 things simultaneously, in the way that pilots trained for emergency procedures execute those procedures, not as a sequence of steps but as a single, fluid action that has been rehearsed until it lives in the muscles rather than the mind. She disabled the autopilot with her right hand and pushed the yoke forward, beginning an emergency descent. 3,000 feet per minute. The aircraft's nose dropped, and passengers in the cabin felt the sudden change in attitude and began to understand that something was genuinely wrong. Diana did not think about the passengers. The passengers would be fine if she did the next things correctly. With her left hand, she reached across to the crew oxygen system and pulled Captain Reed's oxygen mask from its stowage above his seat. She placed it over his face and activated the 100% oxygen flow. His mask first, because he was the captain and because getting him functional was a priority. Then she reached across Mitchell and did the same. With her right hand, keeping pressure on the yoke to maintain the descent, she reached for the radio. Miami Center, American 2891, emergency. She pressed the transmit button and spoke with the flat, precise diction of someone who has transmitted emergency calls under actual fire. Rapid decompression. Both pilots incapacitated. Passenger taking control. Military helicopter pilot. Executing emergency descent to 10,000 feet. Require priority handling and vectors to nearest suitable airport. In the Miami Air Route Traffic Control Center, Controller Daniel Reyes had been monitoring a dozen aircraft trying to navigate around the developing tropical storm when the call came in on the emergency frequency. He heard it perfectly clearly. He heard every word. He was nonetheless certain, for approximately half a second, that he had somehow misheard something, because what he had heard was not a thing that happened. American 2891, he said carefully, confirm you said, passenger taking control. Diana was monitoring the altimeter, 22,000 feet, 21,000, 20,000, the descent working, watching the oxygen masks on both pilots, checking the engine instruments with the quick, comprehensive scan of someone who has memorized what normal looks like and is cataloging every deviation. She keyed the radio with the focused efficiency of someone for whom multitasking is not a skill but a survival requirement. Affirmative. I'm Lieutenant Colonel Diana Washington, United States Army, Black Hawk Commander. Both your pilots are hypoxic. I'm flying the aircraft. I'm executing emergency descent to get everyone to breathable air. You can either help me or watch 160 people die. Your choice. I need vectors now. Daniel Reyes had worked ATC for 16 years. He had handled emergencies. He had talked pilots through systems failures and weather diversions and medical events. He had, on 2 occasions, talked to pilots who he was fairly certain were not going to survive the next few minutes. He knew what panic sounded like. He knew what confusion sounded like. He knew what genuine authority sounded like. The voice on the radio was the last of these things. American 2891, Roger, he said. Descend immediately to 10,000, vectors for emergency landing Fort Lauderdale International, emergency equipment will be standing by. He paused for only a moment. Ma'am, who exactly are you? Diana had the aircraft passing through 19,000 feet. Both pilots were breathing pure oxygen. She could see the color starting to return to Reed's face, the first signs that the oxygen was reaching his brain and beginning to reverse the impairment. The cabin altitude was starting to fall as the aircraft descended to denser air. In 10 minutes, the hypoxia in the passenger cabin would resolve itself. The immediate crisis, the one that ended with 160 people unconscious in an unpiloted aircraft at 35,000 feet, was no longer going to happen. I told you, she said. Black Hawk Commander. Storm. That's my call sign. Now clear me to Fort Lauderdale before I run out of altitude. 40 miles to the south, 2 Army UH-60 Black Hawk helicopters were on a training flight. They were part of the Florida Army National Guard's 2-151 ST Aviation Regiment, flying a nighttime navigation exercise that the approaching storm had complicated but not cancelled. The lead helicopter, Black Hawk 61, was flown by Captain James Hawk Rodriguez, 34 years old, 11 years of Army aviation, 1,900 flight hours. His co-pilot was First Lieutenant Danny Kwan, 27 years old, 3 years in, learning from the best pilot in the regiment. They were monitoring the emergency frequency as a matter of standard practice. Every military aircraft monitors the emergency frequency. Every Army pilot knows that if there is ever a call on that frequency, the call is real, because nobody uses the emergency frequency for anything except emergencies. They heard the entire exchange. Hawk heard the voice, the quality of it, the precision of the transmissions, the total absence of the vocal tremor that appears in untrained people under stress, and he recognized someone who knew exactly what they were doing. Then he heard the call sign. Storm. The name landed in his chest like something physical. Every Black Hawk pilot in the United States Army knew that name. It was not a name you learned from a news story or a press release. It was a name you learned from other pilots, passed along in the way that pilots pass along the names of the people whose achievements have become part of the living mythology of what their aircraft can do. He had heard the name, Storm, in his first year of aviation school. He had heard it again at his first unit, from older pilots who spoke it with a reverence that he had not fully understood then but understood completely now. Commander Washington. Night Stalkers. The most decorated female combat pilot in Army aviation history. Holy, he said, then caught himself. To Quan, that's Commander Washington. The Commander Washington. Night Stalker's legend. She's flying a 737. He keyed the radio. Miami Center, this is Black Hawk 61, flight of 2, we're monitoring American 2891's emergency. Did she just identify as Commander Storm? Black Hawk 61, Miami Center, confirmed, she identified her call sign as Storm. Hawk did not waste another second on communication with the center. He switched frequencies to the emergency channel and transmitted directly to the aircraft. American 2891, this is Black Hawk 61, U.S. Army, we're approximately 20 miles south of your position. Ma'am, are you Commander Diana Washington from the 160th SOAR? In the cockpit of the 737, Diana was managing the descent, checking the oxygen status of both pilots. Reed was regaining awareness, his eyes focusing, his hands beginning to respond, and monitoring the instruments with the comprehensive efficiency of someone running through mental checklists for an aircraft type she had never been trained on but understood from 16,000 hours of understanding aircraft. She heard the transmission from Black Hawk 61 and felt something she had not expected to feel in the middle of a crisis, a small, genuine warmth. She keyed the radio. Affirmative, Black Hawk 61. I'm Storm. Currently somewhat busy. Can this wait? Hawk's response came back immediately, negative, ma'am. Just wanted to confirm before we tell Miami Center that the person flying that commercial aircraft has more flight hours under fire than most commercial pilots have total. If you need visual confirmation of anything, visual confirmation of your landing gear, any assistance whatsoever, 2 Black Hawks are at your disposal. It would be an honor, Commander. Diana was passing through 16,000 feet. Both pilots were now breathing pure oxygen and beginning to recover. Captain Reed had managed to squeeze her arm once, not an attempt to take control, just the squeeze of a man who was conscious enough to register that someone was helping him and wanted to acknowledge it. Mitchell's eyes were open and tracking, though she was still not capable of flying. Diana keyed the radio with the ghost of a smile. Black Hawk 61, Storm copies. Appreciate the vote of confidence. Maintain position for now. I may need visual confirmation of my landing gear on final approach. Stand by. She was not alone. Army aviators were watching her 6. In all the years of her career, through all the missions and the firefights and the moments when the instruments were failing and the aircraft was damaged and the enemy was below, she had never been truly alone, because that was the culture of Army aviation. You did not leave people behind, and that applied to the people in the air as much as the people on the ground. Having 2 Black Hawks 40 miles away, watching, ready, was not going to change the physics of what she needed to do next. But it changed something in the way she was carrying it, and that mattered more than she would have admitted. Captain Reed's voice, when it came, was rough and slow and deeply relieved. What happened? What? He tried to sit up straighter and winced. Oxygen. I'm on oxygen. Rapid decompression, Diana said, keeping her eyes on the instruments. You and your first officer were hypoxic. I initiated emergency descent. We're at 14,000 feet, descending to 10. I have vectors to Fort Lauderdale. Who? He looked at her, taking in the sight of a woman in civilian clothes in the left seat of his aircraft. Who are you? Lieutenant Colonel Diana Washington. U.S. Army. I'm a Black Hawk pilot. I've been flying your aircraft for the last 8 minutes. She glanced at him. How do you feel? Like someone hit me with a truck. He looked at the instruments. What's our altitude? What's our? I have the aircraft, she said. Firmly, but not unkindly. You're recovering. You need another few minutes on the oxygen before your judgment is reliable. Right now I need you to confirm for Fort Lauderdale that you've regained consciousness. Can you do that? He stared at her for another moment. 19,000 hours of flying commercial aircraft. 28 years in the left seat. And he was looking at a passenger in civilian clothes who had just told him she had the aircraft, and his assessment of the situation, running through a brain that was still clearing the fog of oxygen deprivation, was that she was right. Yeah, he said. I can do that. Good. We'll also need your help with some of the systems on approach. I know the principles but I've never trained on this specific aircraft type. I'll need you to work the landing checklist with me. You've never, he stopped. You're landing this aircraft on instinct? Not instinct. Principle. Aerodynamics doesn't change because the aircraft is different. The specific procedures do. She glanced at him again. I can land this aircraft, Captain. I need you to help me do it safely. Can you do that? He looked at her eyes. He had spent a career reading situations and people through his cockpit windows. What he saw in those eyes was exactly what Marcus Thompson had seen 20 minutes ago in the galley. Yes, he said. Tell me what you need. Fort Lauderdale Hollywood International Airport had been notified of the inbound emergency before Diana's aircraft had passed through 12,000 feet. By the time Flight 2891 was approaching from the north, the airport was ready. Emergency vehicles lined both sides of runway 10R. Fire trucks, ambulances, airline operations vehicles, an FAA emergency coordinator who had driven from his dinner table. The tower controller, a woman named Janet Castro who had 15 years of experience and had never in those 15 years seen anything quite like the situation currently on her frequency, had cleared all traffic from the approach corridor and was waiting. Fort Lauderdale Tower, Diana transmitted, American 2891, emergency inbound, approximately 22 miles north, altitude 7,000, requesting priority approach runway 10R. American 2891, Fort Lauderdale Tower, you are cleared priority approach 10R, all traffic held, emergency equipment standing by. Castro's voice was professionally steady. Confirm status of flight crew. Both pilots recovered from hypoxia, stable, assisting from right seat. I'm military helicopter pilot, managing approach. A pause. American 2891, confirm, passenger is conducting approach. Confirmed. U.S. Army. 4,800 total flight hours. Never trained on 737 specifically. A longer pause. American 2891, landing a 737 is significantly different from helicopter operations. Would it be advisable to? Fort Lauderdale Tower. A new voice on the frequency. Hawk's voice. This is Black Hawk 61, U.S. Army, two-ship formation currently flying in support of American 2891. I need you to understand something about the pilot on that aircraft. He paused to make certain the tower was listening. Commander Washington has landed Black Hawks with complete tail rotor failure using thrust vectoring alone. She has landed under fire in areas that were not landing zones because there were no landing zones. She has 327 combat missions. She is the most decorated female combat pilot in Army aviation history, and she is the most composed, most capable pilot I have ever heard on any radio in my career. If anyone on this planet can land an aircraft she's never trained on, it is Commander Storm. I would trust her with my life, and I am trusting her with everyone on that plane. Clear her for the approach. Janet Castro looked at her radar display. Then she looked at the senior controller beside her. Then she picked up her radio. American 2891, you are cleared for approach, call 3 miles final. At 10 miles out, Diana began her configuration. Captain Reed, still slightly rough around the edges but functional and increasingly confident in the woman beside him, walked her through the procedures with the precise, abbreviated communication of pilots who have learned to speak to each other in the compressed vocabulary of emergency operations. Flaps to 15. Speed check. Course correction. At 7 miles, Hawk appeared on her left side. She did not see him, her attention was on instruments, on the approach path, on the wind correction angle and the glide slope indicator and the 100 small adjustments that landing any aircraft requires, but his voice came over the frequency. American 2891, Black Hawk 61 is positioned off your left wing, will stay with you to final. She keyed the radio with her thumb. Black Hawk 61, Storm. Thanks for the company. Wouldn't miss it, ma'am. The two Black Hawks held their position off her left side. In their cockpits, 2 Army pilots flew in careful formation with a commercial airliner, watching. Not because they could do anything if something went wrong, there is nothing a helicopter can do to help a fixed-wing aircraft on final approach, but because leaving was not something Army aviators did. She had said, "Stand by," and they had stood by, and this was them standing by, present and watching and making sure she knew she was not alone. 5 miles. 1,000 feet. Glide slope centered. Gear down, Diana said, and Reed reached across and selected the gear. 3 green lights. Gear down and locked. Flaps 30. Final configuration. The runway lights of Fort Lauderdale appeared through the windscreen, white and green and red and beautiful, the most welcoming thing Diana had seen since she had stepped through the cockpit door. She had been flying on the instruments, had to be, the aircraft was unfamiliar and she was not willing to trust her eyes over her instruments, but now she raised her eyes from the panel and looked at the runway and took in the total picture in the way that pilots do on final approach when the math is done and the hands and eyes take over. The aircraft was perfectly configured. The glide slope indicator was perfectly centered. The airspeed was exactly where it needed to be. Captain Reed, watching everything with the careful attention of a man who had spent 19,000 hours knowing exactly what the correct picture looked like, could see that it was correct. He had flown with hundreds of pilots. He had mentored first officers and trained captains. He knew what good technique looked like. What he was watching from the right seat was not good technique, it was exceptional technique, the product not of training on this specific aircraft but of something deeper, something that lived in the hands and eyes and nervous system of someone who had spent so many hours flying aircraft of every kind in every condition that the principles of flight had become as natural as breathing. 3 miles. The runway filled more of the windscreen. 1 mile. 500 feet above the ground. The runway numbers were visible now. Threshold. 50 feet. Diana pulled back on the yoke in the gentle, precise flare that slows a large aircraft's descent just before the main gear touches the ground. The nose came up. The descent rate decreased. The main gear, the 2 sets of wheels under the wings, contacted the runway with a chirp and a solid thud that was, to everyone in the passenger cabin who had been gripping their armrests and their seatbacks and their neighbors' hands for the last 20 minutes, the single most beautiful sound any of them had ever heard. She brought the nose down. Applied reverse thrust. Applied the wheel brakes with the measured pressure that brings a large aircraft to a stop without drama. The 737 decelerated down the runway and turned off at the taxiway, and then it was stopped, and the engines were spooling down, and 160 people who had been 4 minutes from mass unconsciousness at 22,000 feet were sitting in their seats in Fort Lauderdale, Florida, alive and intact and breathing the thick, warm air of a summer evening near the ocean. On the radio, Hawk's voice came through. Fort Lauderdale Tower, Black Hawk 61. He paused for a long moment. We just watched Commander Storm land a commercial aircraft she has never trained on, after diagnosing rapid decompression that nobody else caught, after getting 2 incapacitated pilots on oxygen while simultaneously executing an emergency descent, after coordinating with ATC while managing a completely unfamiliar aircraft type, and she made it look routine. Another pause. That's why they call her Storm. She flies into disasters. And she brings everyone home. Every single time. Fort Lauderdale Tower Controller Janet Castro sat in silence for a full 3 seconds. Black Hawk 61, she said finally. Her voice was not quite steady. We believe you. That was extraordinary. The passengers deplaned in a way that was different from every other deplaning Diana had ever witnessed from inside an aircraft. They came off quiet. Quiet and shaky and grateful in the way that people are grateful when they have been close enough to death to understand that they almost did not get to come back, and have been given back anyway. Some of them were crying. Some of them were on their phones, calling people, trying to explain something that they did not fully understand themselves. A few of them stopped at the galley on their way out and looked at the cockpit door with expressions that combined awe and confusion, because word had spread through the cabin during the approach, quietly, imperfectly, from one passenger to another, that the aircraft had been landed by a woman from Seat 8A. Diana was the last person off the aircraft. She had stayed in the cockpit to give a preliminary verbal account to the FAA emergency coordinator who had boarded while the passengers were deplaning. She was concise, professional, and thorough, which was exactly how she gave every after-action report in her military career. What happened, when it happened, what she assessed, what she did, why she did it, what the outcome was. Marcus Thompson, the flight attendant who had opened the cockpit door, was waiting in the jet bridge when she came through. "Commander," he said. He had clearly been told her rank and title by someone. I need to thank you. You made the right call," Diana said. "Opening that door. That took courage." "I almost didn't," he admitted. "Everything I've been trained to do said don't open that door." "I know. You opened it anyway because you assessed the situation correctly. That's the job." She put a hand briefly on his arm. "You saved everyone on that flight as much as I did. You're the one who opened the door." She moved past him and out into the terminal. Captain James "Hawk" Rodriguez was there. He had brought his Black Hawk down at Fort Lauderdale. It had taken a radio call and a brief negotiation with the tower, but nobody in the Fort Lauderdale tower was in the mood to refuse a request from the Army pilots who had just provided moral support to the most remarkable approach in the airport's history. He was standing in the terminal in his flight suit, his helmet under his arm, his co-pilot Lieutenant Quan beside him. When Diana came through the door, he came to attention and saluted. "Commander Washington," he said. "Captain Rodriguez, 2-151 ST Aviation. It's an honor to meet you, ma'am." Diana looked at him. He was young, 34, she had been told, with the particular combination of confidence and deference that she recognized from the best young pilots she had ever commanded. He had not had to land at Fort Lauderdale. He had not had to call the tower and vouch for her on the approach. He had done both anyway, because he was an Army aviator and that was what Army aviators did for each other. "At ease, Captain." She shook his hand. "Thank you for the escort. And the vote of confidence. Ma'am, you're a legend. Every Black Hawk pilot in the Army knows your name." She looked at him steadily. "I'm a pilot who happened to be in the right place. With respect, ma'am, no. A pilot who happened to be in the right place would have been frightened. You diagnosed the emergency before the captain screamed. You were in the cockpit before the masks dropped. You were on the radio before anyone else on that aircraft understood what was happening." He shook his head slightly. "That's not happening by chance. That's Commander Storm." She held his gaze for a moment. "Take care of your aircraft, Captain. And your co-pilot." She looked past him to Quan, who was trying extremely hard not to look like he was having the most exciting moment of his young military career. "You're going to be a good pilot, Lieutenant. Pay attention to everything Captain Rodriguez teaches you." Quan blinked. "Yes, ma'am. How did you?" "He's here." She nodded toward Hawk. "That tells me something about him. And here means something." The FAA interview took 2 hours. Diana sat across a table from 3 investigators and answered every question with the same professional precision she brought to every after-action report. What she had noticed. When she had noticed it. The timeline of her actions. Her assessment of the aircraft's systems. The communications she had made and why. The landing approach and the techniques she had applied. The senior investigator, a man named Thomas Garland who had worked aviation safety for 22 years, listened to all of it and then put down his pen. "Colonel Washington," he said, "I've investigated hundreds of aviation emergencies. I've talked to a lot of pilots who have done remarkable things. Can I ask you something off the record?" "You can ask." "When you were in that cockpit, with 2 incapacitated pilots, an aircraft you'd never trained on, 160 people depending on you, what were you thinking?" Diana considered the question with the genuine attention she gave to all questions worth answering. "I was thinking about the checklist," she said. "Emergency descent. Oxygen for the pilots. ATC communication. Approach. Landing. I was thinking about the list in order. When you're trained properly, you don't feel the weight of the situation during the situation. You feel it after." She paused. "I'll feel it later." Garland wrote something down. Then he looked at her. "Off the record, Colonel, that was the most extraordinary piece of airmanship I have ever seen in 22 years of investigating aviation incidents." "On the record," Diana said, "I just did what any military pilot with hypoxia training would have done in my position." He looked at her for a moment. "No," he said quietly. "You didn't. But I understand why you said it." The story broke globally before Diana had reached her hotel. The FAA had issued a preliminary statement. American Airlines had issued a statement. The Army had been contacted by 3 different wire services within an hour of the aircraft landing. By midnight, the story was on every major news network, every major website, every social media platform on the planet. The headline varied, but the substance was always the same. Army Black Hawk commander saves 160 lives, female military pilot lands commercial aircraft after diagnosing crisis nobody else caught. Her name was everywhere. Her photograph, in uniform, from the Army's official personnel file, was on every screen. The call sign, Storm, was trending worldwide. The phrase, "She flies into disasters and brings everyone home," taken from Hawk's radio transmission, which Fort Lauderdale Tower had released because it had quickly become clear that the whole world wanted to hear it, had been replayed thousands of times on every platform imaginable. Diana spent the night in a Fort Lauderdale hotel. She ordered room service. She called her mother. Her mother, whose 70th birthday party was the reason for the entire journey, answered on the second ring. "I've been watching the news," her mother said. Her voice was steady, which was the voice Diana had inherited. Steady under pressure, clear when it counted. "I'm fine, Mama. I know you're fine. You're always fine. That's what makes you so terrifying." A pause. "Are you coming to Boston?" "I'll get there tomorrow." "Different flight." "I'll make your favorites." Another pause. "Diana." "Yes, Mama. I'm proud of you. I've been proud of you for a long time. But today I'm proud of you the way I was proud of you when you were 7 years old and you climbed to the top of that tree and came back down with the neighbor's cat, even though I had told you not to go up after it. You did it anyway because the cat needed help and you knew how." Diana smiled. The hotel room was quiet and the storm outside Miami was still going, and somewhere across the city 160 people were finding hotel rooms and calling family members and sitting with the particular feeling of a day that had almost been something else entirely. "I should go," she said. "I have a press conference tomorrow morning. Don't let them put words in your mouth." "I won't." She paused. "I love you. I love you too. Now go to sleep. You've had a long day." The press conference was brief. Diana stood at a podium in her army dress uniform, with the Distinguished Flying Cross and the Bronze Star and the Air Medal with 15 oak leaf clusters and all the rest of it on her chest, and she looked at the assembled cameras and reporters with the same expression she wore in every situation, calm, direct, slightly impatient to be done. "I was in the right place at the right time with the right training," she said. Any military pilot with hypoxia training would have recognized what was happening on that aircraft. The training exists because the Army puts its pilots in situations where recognizing oxygen deprivation is a survival skill. I recognized it. I responded. I am grateful that the outcome was what it was, and I'm grateful for the crew of that aircraft, who kept 160 people calm in a frightening situation, and I'm grateful for the 2 Army pilots who were good enough to be on the right frequency at the right time. They're the ones who vouched for me to Fort Lauderdale Tower, and that mattered. She looked at the cameras. That's all I have. Thank you. A reporter from the back, Commander Washington, they call you Storm because you fly into disasters. Does this civilian rescue change how you think about your call sign? About your legacy? Diana looked at the reporter for a moment. My legacy isn't about me, she said. It's about the mission. Getting people home. That's what we do in the Army. That's what I did on that flight. The mission doesn't change just because the uniform does. She gathered her notes. The mission is always the same. Bring everyone home. She stepped away from the podium. She made it to Boston 2 days late. Her mother had made the favorites, pot roast and rice and sweet potato pie and a birthday cake that said Happy 70th Barbara in pale yellow frosting, and Diana sat at the kitchen table in the house she had grown up in civilian clothes with no rank insignia and no medals and no weight of command, and ate pot roast and listened to her mother talk about the neighborhood and the garden and the book club. And outside the window the Boston summer evening was warm and ordinary and full of crickets. She stayed for 2 weeks. She slept past 5 every morning. She read the rest of the Tom Clancy novel. She went to her mother's birthday dinner and sat with aunts and cousins and her mother's friends and deflected questions about the flight with the patient grace of someone who would rather talk about other things. She was Diana for 2 weeks. Then she went back. Fort Campbell, Kentucky. Home of the 160th Special Operations Aviation Regiment. The Night Stalkers. Her unit. She drove through the main gate in the early morning of a Monday, her military ID to the guard, her bags in the back seat, the post coming to life around her in the particular way that Army posts come to life before the sun fully rises, physical training formations, vehicles moving on the roads between buildings, the sound of helicopters in the distance from the airfield. The smells of jet exhaust and cut grass and institutional coffee. Her executive officer, Major Terrence Blake, was waiting in front of the headquarters building. Commander. He came to attention. Then, because he was her executive officer and had been with her through 2 of her 3 deployments and was allowed slightly more latitude than most, welcome back. You made us all proud. Again. I just did what any of you would have done, she said. She got out of the car. Is the morning brief ready? Yes, ma'am. Missions are running, training schedule is on track, and we have a new pilot rotation starting next week that I want to walk you through. Good. She moved toward the door. Let's get to work. Commander, your pilots want to celebrate. There's something planned for this afternoon. She stopped. Turned. Looked at him with the expression that her unit had learned to read as, this is not necessary but I understand why you're doing it and I won't stop you. After the brief, she said. Work first. 1 month later. Fort Campbell Airfield. Before dawn. The air was cool with the promise of autumn, the sky still dark but beginning to lighten at the eastern edge, the stars fading one by one as the day came in from the horizon. The airfield smelled of jet fuel and damp grass and the particular metallic mineral scent of Army aircraft that pilots learn to love because it is the smell of their life. Diana walked across the flight line. Her Black Hawk was waiting. UH-60L, tail number 88 to 26077, a helicopter she had flown for the last 4 years. It knew her hands the way a well-broken-in saddle knows its rider, not through any mystical connection but through 10,000 small adjustments and calibrations, through the accumulated knowledge of exactly how much input this specific aircraft needed for each specific maneuver. Her crew chief, Sergeant First Class Anthony Davis, was doing his pre-flight walk-around with the careful attention of a man who understood that his job was the foundation on which all else rested. "Morning, Commander." He did not look up from his inspection of the tail rotor assembly. "Birds ready. Weather's clear. Winds out of the northwest at 8. "Thanks, Sergeant." She placed her hand briefly on the fuselage, not sentimentally, just the automatic touch of a pilot confirming that an aircraft is real. Then she climbed in. The cockpit settled around her like a familiar room. Her co-pilot for the morning, Chief Warrant Officer 3 Melissa Park, was already in the right seat, working through the pre-flight checklist with the efficiency of someone who had done this hundreds of times. "Morning, Commander." She glanced over. "Ready when you are. Let's go." Diana ran her own pre-flight scan. The instruments were alive, the systems nominal, the rotor blade tie-down was released and the blade was free. She looked at the gauges the way she had been looking at gauges for 18 years, not one by one but all at once, the whole panel readable as a single image. "You ever going to tell us about landing that 737? Park asked, with the careful tone of someone who was going to ask and was fully prepared to be told no. "Not much to tell," Diana said. "Emergency descent. Oxygen for the pilots. ATC contact. Approach. Landing. Standard emergency sequence. Commander. You landed a commercial jet on instinct, in the middle of a weather diversion, after keeping 2 hypoxic pilots alive, having never trained on the aircraft type. They're calling you the most versatile pilot in Army aviation." Diana looked up from her checklist. Looked at her co-pilot for a moment with the expression that her co-pilots over 18 years had learned to read as, "This is what I actually think, and I am going to say it once. They can call me whatever they want," she said. "I care about the mission. Bringing people home. That's it. That's all of it." She finished her pre-flight. Started the engines. The Black Hawk came alive under her hands, the turbines spooling up, the rotor beginning to turn, the familiar vibration through the airframe that was the helicopter's version of a heartbeat. "Tower, Black Hawk 77, ready for departure, runway 27. The tower controller, a young soldier on his 3rd month in the job, who had heard the story and who had made a note to himself the first time he had heard her voice on the frequency, responded, "Black Hawk 77, Fort Campbell Tower, cleared for takeoff, winds northwest at 8, and Commander, welcome back. We missed you up here." She was quiet for a moment. The rotors were at full RPM, the aircraft trembling with contained power, everything ready. "Good to be back," she said. She keyed the mic one more time. "Storm is airborne." The Black Hawk lifted off the runway in the first light of a Kentucky morning, rising smooth and powerful into the brightening sky, climbing away from the earth with the unhurried confidence of something that belonged in the air. Lieutenant Colonel Diana Storm Washington. Black Hawk Commander. Night Stalker. The pilot they called when the situation was already catastrophic. The pilot who had recognized what 2 commercial pilots could not catch, who had walked to the front of a commercial aircraft and told a flight attendant to open the door and then gone in and flown the aircraft and brought 160 people home. The pilot who had received congratulations from generals and the FAA administrator and the Secretary of the Army, and had responded to all of them the same way, just doing the job. She leveled off at altitude, set her course, and felt the specific peace that she had never found anywhere except here, in the seat of an aircraft, with the instruments steady and the crew sharp and the mission clear. She flew into the morning. Still airborne. Still bringing people home. Still storm.